I'm sure a couple more people will trickle in and wanted to kick us off and just say thank you so much for joining us today for today's CEO Roundtable. We are grateful for your presence and for your voice at this table for such an important discussion. I will now turn the conversation over to Eileen Ellsworth, President and CEO of the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia, who is serving as today's moderator.
Thank you, Melissa, and hello, everyone. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us today for this roundtable discussion. So thought I would start by sharing some reflections from the CEONet retreat this past September in Chicago that was entitled Community Foundations and Civic Healing, and also discuss the ever-evolving path forward and everyone's perceptions of if there's anything has changed today from when we met in early September, now that the midterms have happened. So just to set the table here a bit, many of us are very disturbed by the civic and social divisions in our country and how those divisions are actually threatening the integrity of our friendships, our families, our communities, and at a macro level, our democracy. But we have few ideas for ways to effectively address them. And I think that is the reason that the planning committee for the Chicago retreat chose the theme of civic healing for the retreat. We want to learn from one another. And as an individual and as a citizen, I've been concerned about those divisions and the damage they could cause to our democracy for many years. And I know many of you have too. But as a community foundation president, the thought that the anchor institutions we run could actually have a role to play in the healing of those divisions first occurred to me in July of 2021 when I read an op-ed in the Washington Post that was written by Michael Gerson. And Stu just told me that Michael Gerson passed away today. So that's a terrible tragedy. I thought he was a wonderful voice on this topic, on many topics. But it's nice in a way that we're talking about him today and the way he's inspired us. In any event, in the print version of the paper, his op-ed was called, quote, "We need a national effort at civic healing." And he began by describing the divisions and their causal relationship to the events of January 6th. He then cautioned us all. He said, responding in kind is never the answer. Fighting fire with fire is to just join the arson, as he put it, and that no form of loving your country involves despising half of its citizens. And then he said this, and I'm certainly editing it a bit here, but this was what really inspired me at a very deep level. He said, some proposed solutions, such as better civics education, or a year of national service, or institutional reforms such as ranked choice voting, tend to sound like naive do-gooderism. But let me rise in defense of do-gooderism as a defining American characteristic. Our civic crisis of vicious polarization can yield only to efforts at civic healing. And civic healing is possible only with a measure of civic idealism. Our spiritual crisis can be opposed only by community institutions that are in the business of meaning. Community institutions in the business of meaning. All I could think of was community foundations. So I'm thrilled to be moderating this conversation with a broader field of community foundation leaders. So we started the conversation in Chicago with a terrific keynote speaker, David Brooks. He's an op-ed writer for the New York Times and obviously was an industry colleague of Michael Gerson's. And I felt that David, in his keynote to the group, added an entirely new dimension of inspiration and understanding around this topic. I took a lot of notes, and I'm going to share a couple of those with you right now. So he began with this. He said, in greater community, there are diminishers and illuminators. And he encouraged us to be illuminators. But by that, he meant train in the craft of curiosity about others. He believes that our policy crisis has roots in actually a spiritual crisis, that when people feel invisible, they lash out, they distrust, they feel alone. And in our country, a symptom of that is they flee to politics. And he said, politics offers them an illusion of a moral system, but there's actually no system. There's no there. There's no actual human contact, no meetings. It's a religion of politics, but without any morality. And he said, there is just, quote, hating the same people together, close quote. So he suggested that one way forward for us would be to help fill the gap of what people are actually missing. He said, try to see every person we meet. Attention to an individual, he said, is not an on-off switch, which I loved. He said, it's not a dimmer. He said, it's full on every second, and it's the way we show up for one another in community. I mean, essentially, he was suggesting that we heal the culture one conversation at a time. And then he said, it takes skill to bring a community together, and that morality that is secular is a true skill. Those were his exact words. And he said, secular morality has the power to lift the country up and out of the cultural wars we suffer from. And then I felt he brought the whole thing down to something a little more relatable and constructive for community foundations. And he said, there's a huge lack of trust that we feel for each other, for our political judgments, for our institutions and our government. It's a huge issue. So he therefore said, how can an institution like a community foundation build trust? And he gave a 4-part answer. 1, be an institution that delivers results for people. 2, be transparent. 3, engage local citizens in solving their own issues together. And 4, connect community through relationships. All in all, I felt Gerson and Brooks have delivered to us a very thoughtful and inspirational ground, a ground for the discussion. So the question now is, what are we going to build on that ground for the communities we serve that contributes to civic healing? So today we have some wonderful peers across the country that are joining us for this conversation. And they include Stuart Comstock-Gay, President and CEO of the Delaware Community Foundation, Shelley O'Quinn, CEO of Innovia Foundation, John Stremsterfer, CEO, Community Foundation for the Land of Lincoln, and Diana Aviv, founder and principal of Our Covenant. Now, Stu, Shelley, and John were all attendees at the Chicago retreat, and Diana was also a speaker at the retreat with David Brooks. She is the former CEO of Feeding America, of Independent Sector, and she was the founding CEO for the Partnership for American Democracy. So before we get started, just a little bit of direction here. Please put your questions in the chat box and raise your hands or come off mute to ask a question if you'd like. The Council on Foundation staff is also going to be monitoring the questions and helping us address them as we go. So let's get started with our questions for the panel. At the retreat, Diana, you shared your concerns over and your knowledge of actual attempts at the local, state, and national levels to harm the integrity of election systems prior to the midterms. So I'd love to start with you. And would you mind, offering your views on the potential of our political and cultural divisions to actually harm our democracy? And has anything, evolved or changed in your view since Chicago, since the midterms?
Thanks, Eileen, and I'm just very happy to be with all of you. I had said it at the retreat, and I'll say it here, that I'm a huge fan of community foundations. I think that you're the center of community, and you connect everybody with everybody. And so what better place to be? Eileen, if you'd said to me, has anything changed since we all gathered together? I would say, well, yes, we've had the midterms. And what was extraordinary about these midterms is that democracy was on the ballot. In fact, according to voters' exit polls from the AP, 44% of the 94,000 voters that they polled said that democracy was their primary concern. And 50% said that the economy was their concern. So it was second to the economy. And what we learned is that actually democracy prevailed, that it won. And like the question is why, and what does it all mean, and what can we expect going forward? The people who were the election deniers, the ones who were flirting with autocracy, many of them were defeated. There's no question about it. We also know that the courts played a role in advance of the midterms in heading off or setting the parameters for how votes would be counted, what would be included and what didn't, and that helped to create an orderly procedure. We didn't see any substantial violence. There were some threats here and there, but for the most part, violence was not, in fact, the main description of what happened in the midterms. And going into the elections, we actually thought it would be. And also, for these midterms, there was an extraordinary turnout, which meant that voters were paying attention and thought it was important to participate and important to make their voices heard. Also, we discovered, as the results started coming in, that most of the most extreme candidates, particularly in the battleground states, were rejected. And especially those who were ones who were challenging our democracy and our whole system. But at the same time, in exit polls, the people coming out who either identified as Republicans or as Democrats, in approximately the same amount of numbers, felt that the other side had too many extreme candidates. So there was still a sense that they were going in knowing that they were rejecting extreme candidates on the other side. But voters also made incredibly clear that they wanted less partisanship in the people who actually do the administration of the elections. They wanted the elections to be orderly. They wanted people who were involved in those roles, aka secretaries of state, to be able to fulfill their responsibilities for all of the citizens who were casting their votes in those particular areas. And we also, to our gratification, heard a lot of concession speeches. In other words, the notion that if you lost, the election was somehow rigged was not the main theme of what came out of here. We heard from many major candidates who said, I concede, and we move on to another day. Now, one of the questions is, what helped make this election, what I would say, normal? Some of the things I'm saying to you should be duh, that's how elections are supposed to be. But they haven't been. And so what were some of the reasons that made it normal? I talked about the courts, but I would say that there was preparation by thousands of nonprofit organizations across the country, educating people about the process of what happens in the election. You saw election officials take much more seriously their role. Law enforcement played a much more active role and were ready to be dispatched if they were needed and showed up in ways that they hadn't before. Federal and state officials showed up in ways that they hadn't before. And there was a major effort, particularly in battleground states, to educate people about how this process works and to be patient and to understand that we won't necessarily know all of the results on election day because of the different systems in different states. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, I think that what happened was as a result of a concerted effort to make sure that we didn't have a different kind of outcome. This didn't just happen by happenstance at all. I think it's safe to say also there were early ballots and a lot more people voted early, so they were afraid that there would be violence, and that helped offset some of those fears as well. But for those who think that, oh, good, democracy's fine, we can all move on to other things. I know Stu will speak next or soon, and I'm sure he will agree with me that this is a battle we've won, but it's not necessarily yet a war that we've won. And that we will need a number of election experiences over the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years before we are sure that democracy is secure and that we're okay. So I would say to you that it's not so fast. And let me just say a couple of quick points about that. Remember that there's depolarization, that there are a few notable races, particularly in areas that are considered to be battleground states, where people won by big margins. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania as governor, that comes to mind. There are others as well. But most of these were just 51-49, very close indeed. In fact, you could count the number of votes in the hundreds or the thousands,
Yep.
which means that 49.5% of the people didn't agree with who's in office, and therefore reflect a deeply polarized society. If our elected leaders don't try and speak to the people who didn't vote for them, as much as they did for those who did vote for them, we're in trouble. And a good example, Eileen, is when Michael Gerson said exactly that in that piece. If any of you want to read the description in the Washington Post about Michael Gerson's passing, there's a piece in there in which he said that we've come to learn that we need to figure out how to govern for the people who don't vote for us as well. Exactly. So that's very important. And so I think that the next couple of years are going to be absolutely critical for what we all do and what community foundations do in particular. And just a very quick notes on that. There will be for sure regulatory, legislative and structural reform at the federal level and at the state level. I'm sure that you've got organizations within your communities who do that work. And I think it's very important for those organizations to know that you support that work. Whether you have the funding for it yet or not, doesn't mean that you can't play a role. But to me, the most important role that community foundations can play is to be a portal for all of the different elements of democracy, so that law enforcement and public officials and the courts and academics and practitioners can come together and see the community foundation as a vehicle both for sharing and disseminating information, for making sure that democracy is a plank that continues and that is a priority, and that efforts, ultimately, our elections are local, and therefore the role of the community foundation remains absolutely critical. I'll end with that for now.
Well, I mean, that's certainly a message of hope, right? We should be hopeful about the democracy after the midterms. I care less about who gets elected. I just want the person who takes the seat to have actually gotten elected, because that's what democracy is, right? You want it to be to have integrity. So yeah, I had the same take on our democracy, Diana, after the midterms. So next, let's turn to the three community foundation leaders we have on the panel to hear their thoughts about the role community foundations can actually play in civic healing, perhaps with some specific suggestions of how to address the topic. So Shelley, I would love to start with you. I was looking at the city of Spokane and its voting tendencies, which is the region that, the county and the city that you serve. And it looks like the city of Spokane tends to lean left, while the county of Spokane tends to lean right. So you, like me, frankly, you have a very evenly divided service area along political lines, or it seems that way. And you had expressed some thoughts in Chicago at the retreat about the difficulties of raising this issue in a politically divided service area, where you've got members of your board, members of your staff, all of your donors. They're a mix of Democrats, Republicans, and everything, in between. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those thoughts right now.
Yep, thank you. And I'm going to actually put in even a little bit more context. So we serve all of Eastern Washington and North Idaho. And in that area, we're urban and rural, and it's the city of Spokane, which basically I would say is more liberal. And if you've read it all about North Idaho, you know that they're the other extreme. And so we are in this interesting political community that we live in, though mostly, except for the city of Spokane, we are solid red. And what I find that the challenge is with this conversation is that we approach this conversation is that it's Democrats versus Republicans. And so that we're not actually fighting for our democracy, but that we're viewing it with that political lens. And that's just not the case. It's not the reality we live in. But when we start conversations around civic healing by taking it just to a January 6th, it immediately assumes that we're approaching this as this is, wanting to pursue a Democratic or liberal or progressive agenda, when really it's not about the politics. We have in our region, and let me share this perspective in saying that when I came into my role as a community foundation CEO, I left being an elected Spokane County commissioner as a Republican. And I came over 5 years ago, and I walked into philanthropy and walked into, like within the first 2 weeks, this huge gathering of 300 individuals philanthropy around the state of Washington and our region at the Gates Foundation. And I sat through an entire 2 days feeling like I was being attacked. And now you have to understand, I took over in June of 17. So considering the dynamics of Trump had just been elected. And I spent 2 days of feeling like Republicans were being persecuted in that meeting. And I finally had to stand up and say, this is not about Republicans being bad people. And when you look at what's going on in our region, in our community, we have about 25% of North Idaho is new population in the last 3 years.
Wow.
Unfortunately, folks see North Idaho as kind of the last political freedom, frontier freedom. And so you have this influx of folks that have been extremely politically conservative. And I would call them the Trumpers and the far right. They're not Republicans, but they have taken over the Republican Party. What you have seen and why democracy is working, as Diana talked about, is that your normal Republicans here actually created their own party since the Central Committee was taken over by the extremes. So your normal Republicans here actually have created their own party. They put up their own candidates. They've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into getting more normal conservative Republicans in office. Mm-hmm. And so it's not necessarily this, Republican versus Democrat environment that we're having this conversation, but too often we approach it that way. Mm-hmm. We have conservative Republicans who are just as concerned about saving our democracy as we do folks in the Democratic Party. And if we continue as philanthropy to approach this from a political lens, where we think it's Republicans versus Democrats versus all of us coming together to save our democracy, we will continue to be challenged. And I know when we try to have these conversations in our community, if we approach it with a political lens, people turn away. They shut down because philanthropy is just liberal. Philanthropy is just progressive. Like they don't care about my values as a conservative. Mm-hmm. But if we can approach it in a conversation that it's about all of us, regardless of political party, coming together to save our democracy, exactly. Then we can actually have conversations about how we work together.
Yeah, I mean, we're all Americans first, right? That makes complete sense to me. Thank you for sharing that. I live in a parallel universe here in Northern Virginia, so I get exactly what you're saying. All right, so Stu, let's turn to you. As many of you may or may not know, before Stu began running the Delaware Community Foundation, he led the Democracy Program at Demos in New York. He led the National Voting Rights Institute in Boston, and he also led the Maryland affiliate of the ACLU. So, Stu, you've been looking at democracy in a prior life, every which way. And you've been engaged in some bridging work lately at the Community Foundation. Wondering if you can share some of that work with the group here today.
Yeah, boy, forgive my voice. I'm doing the best I can here. But I'll say that I actually view my career as one thing. It's all about getting people a piece of the pie and giving everybody a share of this wonderful country we have, whether it's through civil liberties work, voting rights work, other kinds of democracy work. Having said that, a lot of what I was doing in previous iterations was advocacy for same-day voter registration, various things like that. And in instant runoff voting, by the way, I had the great opportunity to observe that in Scotland the first time they did it, and watch them, and it changed the leading party in the country. It became the Scottish National Party won because the plurality no longer won, and people's second votes rose up. And so you didn't just get a plurality that 2/3 of the country was unhappy about. So it's very interesting, and it changes things and makes people more invested in the solution. But be that as it may, yeah, I think, first of all, I want to say, I think community foundations should establish democracy as one of our core values. And we can find the right word, but it's a fundamental part of what we do. I think it's a fundamental part of what we already do. And I think naming it and owning it and leaning into it in different forms is something we all should be doing, because without it, I don't know how we survive effectively as community foundations. So there are a lot of different aspects. We're talking mostly about bridging differences, which is the way I like to talk about it. We've got other things going on around civic education, around local journalism, but I'm going to talk about the bridging differences because I think that really is a fundamental thing. And Shelley talked about not starting every conversation with Democratic and Republican approaches, but talking about differences and how do we get underneath them and how do we find the things that we share in our belief system. I agree with Diana that we saw such incredible progress. What we learned, and a lot of us were fearful, what we learned is that people do believe in democracy or a democratic republic, or call it what you will. People do believe in it, and that right now, if you go too extreme, you're going to lose, at least in this election. Things can change. But I think that was very encouraging to say, okay, people are on this side and believing in it. And I think for community foundations, there are a whole lot of things we can do. I want to talk about some of our bridging activities that we have engaged with. It's an ongoing process, and I'll start with just regular community conversations, where one of the things we do on different topics, mostly around opportunity and equity and civil society, where we're intentional about having panels that are representative, not just of racial diversity or in our state, upstate, downstate diversity, but also about political diversity and making sure that we've got voices and we don't necessarily call it out, but having voices of people that think a little bit differently about these things.
Yeah.
Bringing in people like Rich Harwood to do a focus group with people in Dover, trying to identify differences that people have and commonalities they have. And I'll say most recently, one of our signature programs is our annual book event, what we call our Building Opportunity event, where we bring in authors, Putnam and folks like that. And just yesterday, we had our event for this year with Monica Guzman. And some of you will know her. Her book is, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Difficult Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. She works at Braver Angels. She's fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And we give out 500 books. We encourage book circles. We had about 60 book groups read the book in advance. So when they came into the session yesterday, they were already ready to go to talk about this. And we're really leaning into this idea. How do you work with people who are different than you? And that's what she talks about. And so it's a bit of a step beyond for us to be very explicit. This is the training we want to give to people. How do you have hard conversations? How do you find the things that you can agree on? And how do we collectively work toward these solutions? So that those book circles are a place where we're generating that work. One of the follow-ups is a series of podcast discussions that we'll be launching in 2 weeks with her, but also with people on different sides of the political divide, on religious divides. One of the interviews I did was with our local state senator, Sarah McBride. Some of you will know of her. She's the highest elected trans person in America, and a Republican state rep, talking about how they work together and why they work together. And I'll say what Sarah said, one of the wonderful things she said, think about being in the General Assembly. She said, it's a workplace. In what other workplace would it be acceptable to go in and instantly hate a third of the people there and start treating them like crap? She said, that doesn't work in a workplace. We have to work together. And I thought it was such a wonderful thing. And she said, we focus far too much on policy differences. We have to start with each other as people. And in her case, and you can imagine being a trans person, all the crap she's gotten in her life. And she said, I've been going around for 20 years and people think I shouldn't exist as a person. Why are policy differences problematic for me? They're nothing. I can deal with policy differences in my sleep. So let's get to it and let's talk about what we can do to solve problems. And I think that's the impetus we ought to have. And one more thing I'll say. One of the fellows I interviewed in this podcast is a very, very conservative guy from Southern Delaware. He has a development company, has a fund with us. He actually took his Methodist church and split it so there could be a conservative church. As some of you know, the Methodist church politics has changed since they've done LGBT. Well, he created the conservative church in his town. He said they were going too liberal. He loves having these discussions. He said, people I know would not want to talk to Sarah McBride, but I think we need to talk and try to understand each other. And I think, to Shelley's point, people want to have these conversations and they want venues to have the conversations. And so either creating them on our own, or in our case, also, I'm throwing a lot of things in here, partnering with libraries. The libraries are great allies in this work. We have, so, the state libraries, the city libraries, the downstate libraries are a place where there is a receptivity to say, let's partner with each other on this. And I could go on and on about different ways to get at that, but I'll stop there to allow conversation.
For all of you that weren't early to the webinar today, Shelley and I were talking about how we want to steal Stu's idea and do the book club next year at our community foundations. Because it just sounds like a great, constructive, non-threatening, and yet effective way to get people thinking about their divisions and ways to bridge them. So I think it's a beautiful idea, incredible ideas too. Thank you. Okay, John, we're going to turn now to John. And John was telling me a few weeks ago about some political bridging work he's actually done, jumped right into the getting the politicians to talk to a greater piece of community. And John, your community foundation took the lead on some local conversations with local officials, about the civic and social divisions in Springfield, Illinois. And I believe you call that initiative the Next 10. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Eileen. Before I jump into describing that project, just a general thought, I've been in not-for-profit fundraising work pretty much my entire career. And those lists they always have of the top motivators, why people give. The tax deduction is usually 4th or 5th, I think. But I've always thought if they took it away or threatened it, it'd probably go up to number 1. I kind of feel the same way about democracy here. And I think it was an awakening the last few years when people realized it could be taken away, that it's not a surprise, as Diana mentioned, it was number 2, I think you said, an exit polling of why people voted. I saw in Speaker Pelosi's remarks today that she mentioned democracy is fragile. So I think there's a reason why we should be talking about this. So just to start, that's been on my mind a lot, especially since our visit in Chicago. A little bit about this Next 10 initiative. I want to do a shout out to my friend Nancy Van Milligan here. I see her. Hi, Nancy. Really, this project was inspired by a field trip our foundation took up to Dubuque a few years ago, where they had a top 10 project in their community. We kind of modeled after that some thinking of how we could really rejuvenate our local community and get big, bold ideas moving, because we felt some inertia here in the Springfield region. And we decided to move forward on that project in early 2020, voted to find some consultants February board meeting, and then the pandemic hit, and it kind of changed us off course briefly. But then we decided, how could we really use this as a source of inspiration for people in our world, of how they might think of what our community looks like post-pandemic, if we ever get there. And I'm recovering today from COVID, first day back in the office. So someday, I think it'll happen fully. Nonetheless, we really did a lot of outdoor and online activities to hear voices of people in the community. It generated hundreds of ideas for our local community. And then we issued a report last year, and we're working at that every day. It's changed my job in a way I never quite anticipated. Almost every day I'm engaged personally with a conversation about how we pursue a project that came out of that Next 10 initiative. But along the way, in addition to the public input we were seeking, I was having a lot of one-on-one conversations with elected officials from the local, state, and federal level. Had even an hour conversation with the governor of Illinois. It was really, for me, a remarkable learning experience. And these folks are people we've interacted with a lot, but never quite as intentionally. And what struck me was this sense of gratitude from all the elected officials that we were doing something like this. In a sense of almost, at least I don't know how the political climate's been in your communities and your states, in Illinois, we've had a lot of struggles. If you've paid attention to our us on the national level, sometimes, you know, after you're served your term as governor, you go to federal prison here in Illinois. But we've had a lot of malaise, I feel, and so hearing it directly, and you know, when you have that one-on-one with your local elected officials or federal, whoever, they're a little more frank, and there was just this sense of gratitude that we were doing this, and almost like they didn't feel empowered to have a similar type of conversation from their role as an elected official. And that to me was striking, in both good and bad ways, flattering in a sense that they thought we were the right group to do this, but also a little sad in that they, not everybody's the same in this reaction, but I think the majority of them were just feeling they couldn't have that discussion, I think because of this partisan political divide we have. So with that, I think why we have some assets that can do this and why we continue to. I've been thinking more about this since our time in Chicago. I've always felt the greatest asset we have is not the monetary assets, it's the trust that we have of our communities. And kind of to what Diana was saying and encouraging us to do this work, I think that's the most valuable commodity we have, and we need to use it wisely. And I think there's a role for us to play in this notion of just how we preserve our democracy. So I think when you boil it down to what you do, however, I think it's kind of simple. You just do the work. You bring people together, you focus on projects, and you do them. And I think that, to what Shelley was saying, that, you know, it shouldn't be about Democrats and Republicans. It should be about the work of community. And I think that's why I've always loved this work. I've been in it 2 decades now. And I've always felt there's no other type of entity that has the potential to address as many issues other than community foundations, short of government. So I think that's why we are maybe so critical to this conversation outside of the political government realm, because of the possibilities we all hold within our mission of being able to affect change on a community level. So I'm happy to talk more as we go on about our specific project, but I'm proud of the work because I think we were able to rally people, common citizens, elected officials, focus on projects that cleared the space to really get things moving in our community in a positive way.
Thanks, John. My next question was definitely inspired by something Shelley said at the retreat in Chicago. And it has to do with words, like the words that we choose to discuss this topic with our donors, with our community. You know, you want to use words that evoke helping to level the playing field or helping to build a community that, you know, works for everyone. And you want to use the right words. You don't want to trigger anyone's politics, right? And to your point, Shelley, you have to find the right words that doesn't trigger people's politics, but still brings people together on the topic that you're trying to discuss and the issue you're trying to move forward. Wondering if any of you have given any thought to that, like maybe part of our learnings and sharings here is just about the vocabulary, you know, ideas on what's the vocabulary, what's the common language we as community foundations can speak.
Can I
just is that okay, Stu? You want to go?
Yeah, Diana, yeah, go ahead.
Just a couple of thoughts. There's a lot of work that's been done by PACE, the organization that Kristen Campbell leads, on what kind of language people who tilt more on the progressive side and those who tilt more on the conservative side prefer. And I think, and the information is available publicly, so it's worth going on the PACE website and taking a look at the language, because there is different language. There are code words. We know that if people say right to choice, means a whole bunch of things to everybody. If people say right to life, it means a whole bunch of things to other people. And we're not necessarily going to say choice life. It's sometimes there is language and culture that is reflective and comfortable for different kinds of communities. And I think that as leaders of a community, it's important to know who you're talking to, and that it might be important to do 2 things. One is to be mindful and respectful of the language that people feel comfortable with, because that's going to engender trust. Exactly. And like what we're talking about here is trust. Secondly, it's also important to recognize, because it's true for all of us, that messengers matter. There's a huge amount of work that's been done also on this, and I'm happy to source some of that for you, you know, if all of you are interested in that, on which kinds of messengers matter to which kinds of audiences. But what we have learned, Issue 1 has done a huge amount of work on this. And what we have learned is that people have to be profoundly local. They have to be experts in their areas locally, and that they then have to be known to the local community. Bring in a national expert, not so much, so much, doesn't work. That it's much more important. So that in fact, that's another reason why community foundations can play a profoundly important role of identifying who are the local news media. You may have newspapers that have closed, but there are local journalists there who have the trust because they've known so many people, and that's a person that can be brought in. So, and then the last thing I would say, and I can't underscore this enough, and that is that it's more important to listen than to talk, and to hear what people have to say, and to hear what's on their minds and what's bothering them, and don't presume that you know. I'm working right now with the conservative evangelical community on democracy-related things. I can't tell you how many of my friends on the progressive side say, so have you brought them over yet? You know, have you brought them over to our side? As if the goal, have you told those crazies a thing or two? So that there's an assumption that all of conservative evangelicals think lockstep, which is just not true. Secondly, that the goal is to bring them to us, as if us is monolithic as well. And so I think as we think about this, we have to be mindful of our own language, and we have to hold the people who we know accountable for their own prejudices so that they ratchet that down.
Yeah, I was just going to double down on the PACE thing, and I posted it in the chats, the survey. And you know, I think most of you have come across this by now, but there are words that if you say them that we think are nothing words, and people say, oh, that means you're liberal or that means you're conservative. And it really is important to understand that. And notably, all the civil society, civic participation, all those terms, everybody says, I don't know what it means. Yeah, leave me alone. And so we think those are replacement words, but they're really not. So it's just tricky. It's worth looking at that and seeing how you may be falling into a trap sometimes in your language.
You know, I always, you'll hear me say words matter a lot, because I believe if we're going to lead in areas of, you know, civic healing, racial healing, we have to meet our communities where they are. And we have to understand that if we come in and start speaking down to people, or speaking in a language that immediately turns them off, they're not going to engage in a conversation. So how can you lead when you've immediately shut people down? And so I have two examples that I give in this, is that, you know, as a community foundation and as a team, we value diversity, equity, inclusion in our community, in our staff, in our region, but we cannot say the word equity in North Idaho. And I mean, equity is translated as communism. We actually have an entire work group, a funders group in North Idaho that works specifically on how do we advance equity in North Idaho without actually saying the word equity. And it's a statewide thing. And you can actually do it. And people, and I think what's really hard for some of our Seattle I-5 corridor national funders or national folks doing this work is they don't understand that it's actually you can actually lead in this issue without saying the word equity. The same thing, we are launching a region-wide promise scholarship initiative, and we can't say the word education or college in North Idaho because they're not they have a 37% rate statewide. So that includes Boise of going on to college after high school. It's dismal in the state of Idaho. And if you say the word college, they immediately shut you down because you have to remember it's an industry, it's a region that is lumber, historically mining, lumber, manufacturing. And so if you say education or you say college, people shut down. So we are launching an entire regional scholarship initiative without saying those words in North Idaho. We actually have changed our language based on community, and we did a whole bunch of community meetings and task force meetings. And so we say post-high school. What are you doing post-high school? And we talk about that. And so if a student says, well, I'm going to be a doctor, well, obviously they're going 4 years and beyond. If they say they're going to go be a manufacturer, then they're going to go into the trades, right? We never once say the word education as we are launching this region-wide initiative. So it is possible to lead in a way that you meet people where they are if you recognize that words matter and that it's actually okay to meet people where they are as you lead in that work.
Very much so. Very much so. John.
Well, wow, that's kind of shocking just to hear that story, but
not surprising, right? Words
yeah.
trigger people. So how can you get everybody behind the idea without using the word that triggers people?
I guess I take from that point, Shelley understands that because she lives there and is in that region. And that's where I think we do play this role, because we kind of know those, weird little facts about our own communities and the people there. The one thing that really struck me from what David Brooks said in Chicago, and I've been talking about this, we had a 20th anniversary celebration that same week where I had remarks, and I kind of used his inspiration for those remarks, and we were in a big room, 400 people. It was the first time a lot of people had been to an event in 2 years, and I just stressed the importance, which I think is what Brooks was saying, of being around one another and the importance of that, making those personal connections. And I don't know exactly how we do that other than having parties and fundraising events or whatever, and conversations and all of it. But I think it's so important. And I think we've lost a lot of that. And that's been, the social science research on that for decades now. We don't join clubs like we have. We're just not around people. It's all online. It's not together. But gosh, we got to change that, I feel. We have to be around one another, because it's awfully hard to hate somebody when you talk to them. And it's easy to do it when you're pounding the keyboard at them. So I don't know how intentionally you do that. But when you do that, you can see the body language of someone who frowns when you say the word education, I suspect. And then you go, oh, better watch that. And so that's where the knowledge that we have of our own local communities is really valuable for this notion of civic healing, because we are community foundations. It's what we are. Yep. And I think we have to be intentional of how to get people around each other, which I think is what Brooks was saying.
So I'm going to open this up to questions now. And while folks are thinking about what you may want to ask, to your point, John, I took away from David Brooks's talk, I think more than anything, this idea that attention is not an on-off switch. I just loved that, and I think community foundations are really good at listening. I think community foundation leaders are really good at listening. It's why we're successful. But I'll tell you, that changed me. I think about that now when I'm having a conversation with someone and I sense my mind is starting to wander. I snap it back to attention because I think he's right. It's not an on-off switch and it's not a dimmer. And I really learned something from him that day and took it into my practice. All right. Are there any questions? Yes, Nancy.
So I want to agree with John. This idea of being in front of people, talking to people is so important. We did get a grant once. We were working on these energy districts, and we got it from Nathan Cummings. And they encouraged us to double the grant and use that second half to engage people, to get people together, to have conversations. And I have to tell you, it was such a good lesson for me. And we've gone deep, as you know, John. We do a lot of community engagement, use a lot of different tools. We have regional roundtables. We constantly bring people together around topics. Right now, we're doing an 8-month racial equity profile where there's community conversations. But I think the other thing to remember in this is proximity. You really need to be that proximate leader to truly accelerate trust. I think we need to help national funders to understand that. So instead of funding us that serve rural through some intermediary to fund us, let the people on the ground, the people closest to the people, and we take that very seriously in our office, where we even take it out to the neighborhoods and to our affiliates where they are better voices, and we can be beside them, but let them lead the conversations, let them build the trust in their own communities. And I think that's really an exclamation point on all this work, is that importance of proximity to actually building community and building trust.
And recognizing it's not all on us, right?
Right.
It can't possibly be all on us. It's on like-minded institutions that come together and let the others lead. Yeah. Thank you for that, Nancy. Heather, you have your hand up here.
Great, thanks. So I was not able to join you in Chicago, and I heard from my friend Sean up in Duluth that I really missed out. So it's great to be part of this conversation. I just, Shelley, wanted to say it's so helpful for me to hear you speaking, because part of what I've been really struggling with is feeling like there's this, I don't even want to say encouragement, but demand or expectation from the philanthropic community that, you need to get off your neutral convener pedestal and start talking about race, and slow is not an option. And we are in a region, Shelley, kind of like yours, where we're, yes, like when Minneapolis was burning in March of 2020, we could see the fire from the bridge here in Hudson. And yet when we teed up a series of events focused on race, we had several donors and community members who just went, why the heck are we talking about race? Race is not an issue here. And we're kind of upset that we were the ones stepping in. And so it's been tricky. And I think to acknowledge that, yes, we all need to be doing work on this, and we can't all expect to be working at the same pace because of the realities in our communities, that some of us are really walking on eggshells. And if we're going to make any progress, we need to acknowledge that and work with it, as opposed to just ignoring it and charging ahead like a bull in the china shop. So thank you, Shelley, for your comments. That was really helpful for me to hear, because I've been feeling a bit like I'm somehow not doing my job because I'm not pushing harder. And so it's great to hear you talk about how do you push, but push with the right words. Thank you.
So I'll give some tools of how we've done this. So as I said, if you just jump in, as you've mentioned, you can end up turning people off versus bringing them into a conversation. So we are asked, as I'm sure you all are, to fund and sponsor events all the time. We have a rule that we only will consider a sponsorship if it is an event that creates courageous conversations. And so because that limits right there. We're not just going to sponsor a fundraiser for a local nonprofit because we have thousands of them, but we will sponsor an event for a nonprofit or for another entity that has courageous conversations. By doing that, we started associating our name with conversations that would be speakers maybe at our local university. We have a presidential leadership forum. They bring in someone from the right and then someone from the left, and they go back and forth each year, right? So they're bringing different perspectives in. We've featured Holocaust speakers. We made a point of saying we will sponsor things that create courageous conversations. Mm-hmm. Then we also started incorporating, we do an annual leadership summit, which we model off of Oregon Community Foundation. And we bring together our nonprofits and our communities and our volunteers. And so we always have a speaker that will challenge us around, thinking about, racial equity, but we do it in a way that is inviting them in. It's building bridges. So we use her a lot because she's absolutely amazing, and you may have heard her, but Erin Jones, and you can't see the book, I'll put it in the text. She has this book called Bridges to Heal. She is this beautiful African-American woman out of Seattle who was raised by white parents because she was adopted. And she's got this great story. So similar things to Stu's speaker who talks, he just had this liberal who with conservative parents. She is able to share a message that actually invites people in, and she's encouraging folks to build relationships with people that think differently. So we tend to use her a lot because one, our community loves her, but she gets people uncomfortable but comfortable, if that makes sense. So we focus on making people uncomfortable but not turning them off. And then we feel our job is to keep pressuring. And so we kind of get a little edgier each time, right? So we're not staying status quo. We're making people more and more uncomfortable, which is a good thing, but we're not shutting them down. So, and then the final piece is that we've partnered with the Spokesman Review, and they do the book club, but we sponsor it, and they can bring in some really edgy speakers. And so that's how we've approached that work, and it's worked really well.
If you can find an uncomfortable middle ground that doesn't turn people off, that is the highest and best use of that kind of conversation. That's amazing. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Kate, you put some things here. You put a question or several questions in your here in the chat. Did you want to ask anybody in particular something? Kate Hotler?
I'm just so grateful for the way that Shelley's leading this conversation. Everything that she's saying just resonates so much with the things that I'm seeing in the Yakima Valley, which is in South Central Washington, near Spokane. So I am very new to library foundation leadership and am just looking for a new way to reinvigorate the Valley with a lot of the things that we're saying, because I know libraries can be these spaces for courageous conversation and for coming together. So I'm fascinated coming into the world of philanthropy by the ways that I don't see us in the national conversation talking about class. Like, I feel like it makes me almost paranoid that there is the conversation around the machine is functioning perfectly at the thing that it was designed to do. This idea that, like, they're trying to distract us with all the identity politics, because if we talked about the actual mechanics of how money works and how distribution of wealth works, that might point at the, the people that are in power don't really love that because it doesn't behoove them. And so, that it's like, until we can actually talk about that, I don't know, and maybe that's too abstract, but
no, I don't think it's abstract.
Are we to point to that and be like, hey, we need to agitate a little bit as the people that hold the purse and say, guys, identity politics yes, it's important, absolutely, so much, and yes, we have to have a sense of urgency around it, and can we include class in that framework in a way that's meaningful?
So I think the way I think about that is it is certainly one more thing that divides us. And if you ignore it, you can't address it. Race can divide us, class can divide us, income levels can divide us, politics divide us. You still have to figure out the language going forward. It's absolutely a valid point. All right, so I'm sorry.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, just one more thing. I want to honor everyone's time here. We've got to wrap up at 3 minutes.
Totally on board with this race, class, place, the partisan divide, this whole piece. But I do want to also lift up that there's a time and a place that you almost have to name it. We were having cross burnings. We were having IBM came to town with 1,100 people, and they were not being treated well. And IBM came to leadership in town and said, something needs to happen. We did have a long conversation. Is it equity? Is it inclusion? We ended up creating a network called Inclusive Dubuque. We started talking about equity. We did have a couple donors leave us, but we also had a number of donors came on, and we really decided we wanted people funding us that were really in line with our values. And after about 5 years of doing that, I think it was, George Floyd was killed, and our rural counties reached out to us and said, you need to help us have these conversations. We have to do this. So I think we need to choose the right language. We need to meet people where they're at, but sometimes you do have to name what it is and what the issue is and tackle it. And I don't think I'm disagreeing with anything that Shelley said or anyone else said, but I did feel the need to bring that up, that sometimes you just got to call it what it is and tackle it head on.
Exactly. All right. Melissa, I think you wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the next roundtable, or Christy, did you want to talk a little bit about what the next roundtable is and when it's happening?
I'm looking at Christy if she wanted to speak first. Go ahead.
We don't know yet, but I think we'll aim for the first quarter, won't we, Melissa?
Yes, that is the plan. The date will be announced, and Christy does a wonderful job of announcing that on our philanthropy exchange, which is the link in the chat. If there are topics of conversation that you want to bring forward to this group, please, we would love to hear from your insight and your voice. And I also want to plug that our Leading Locally conference just launched for registration is now open. And I want to say thank you so much for our planning group, our conversation starters, and Eileen, thank you so much for moderating this conversation. Extremely valuable, and we are so grateful for your time and energy. That when we end this call, that the work continues. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to
Nice
all of
job.
our panelists, Diana, Shelley, John, Stuart, everybody who asked a question, everybody who came. What I'm taking away from this is the importance of being around each other, listening and learning, remembering our shared humanity. And I think that's our North Star. All right. Thank you, everybody. So appreciate it. Bye now.